Before the gods were powerful, 3 women were already working. That is the thing most people never hear about the Norse pantheon. Not the part about Thor throwing lightning, or Odin sacrificing an eye for wisdom, or even Loki unraveling everything with a smirk. The part they miss is this: there were 3 figures in the Norse cosmos whose authority surpassed every god who ever lived, every giant who ever stood tall against the sky, every hero who ever drove a sword through the dark. 3 figures who answered to no one. 3 figures who could not be worshipped into mercy, bargained with, threatened, or moved. 3 figures who sat at the root of the world, beneath the greatest tree that has ever existed or ever will, and carved the fate of every being in every one of the 9 worlds, into the bark of that tree and into the grain of time itself. Even Odin knew their names. Even Odin could not change what they had written. We'll return to that detail, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why it reframes everything you thought you knew about the Norse myths. For now, let your breath slow. The world outside is doing whatever it does. The distant sounds, the small familiar dark of wherever you are lying. None of it needs your attention. Let it go. We are going somewhere older tonight, deeper than Valhalla, deeper than the halls of the gods. We are going to the root of the world, to the well, to the place where 3 women have sat since before the first dawn broke over the first morning, and where they are sitting still, in whatever part of you still hears old stories in the dark. Their names are Urd, Verdandi, Skuld. This is their story, which means in ways you may not have considered, it is also yours. To understand the Norns, you have to understand something about the Völuspá, which is the poem that begins everything. The Völuspá is the opening poem of the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse verse that forms, along with Snorri Sturluson's 13th century prose Edda, the primary surviving record of Norse mythology. The word means the seeress's prophecy. It is exactly that. A dead Völva, a female shaman and oracle, speaks from beyond the grave at Odin's bidding, narrating the birth of the cosmos, the golden age of the gods, the coming catastrophe of Ragnarök, and whatever lies after. It is one of the most profound cosmological poems in the entire Germanic literary tradition. And somewhere in its early stanzas, something happens that disrupts the whole story. The gods had been living well. They had built their halls in Asgard. They were playing at board games in their courtyards. They were eating, drinking, enjoying their golden age with the satisfaction of beings who believe they have earned it. The Völuspá describes this time with a particular warmth. The world was young, the gods wanted for nothing, and the light was good. Then the poem says something that has puzzled scholars for centuries. 3 beings arrived from Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. The poem does not announce them with fanfare. It simply states, in the terse way of all truly important things, that 3 mighty maidens came out of Jotunheim, and from the moment of their arrival, the gods' days of ease were over. The poem describes them as Thursa Majar, giant women, powerful beyond measure, who came and began to set laws and to carve the lives of men and to fix their fates. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Here is what most retellings leave out. The Norns did not come from the divine realms. They were not Aesir, not Vanir, not born from any god's bloodline. According to the Völuspá, they were giantesses, from the oldest and most primordial race in the Norse world. They came from the same realm as the beings the gods spent much of their history fighting. And when they arrived, not as enemies, not as allies, just as themselves, the golden age of the Tar, gods was, quietly and permanently, disturbed. The Norns are the reason the gods could not simply be happy forever. They brought time with them. real time, with consequence and obligation and an ending. Before the Norns came, the gods' world had the quality of a dream, pleasant, ungrounded, outside of history. After the Norns arrived, history began. Their home is a specific place. It is not some vague, otherworldly domain, but a precisely located one. Beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the great ash tree that holds all 9 worlds together, at the edge of a well called Urdabrunner. Picture that for a moment. Yggdrasil is the axis of the entire Norse cosmos. According to the Prose Edda, its 3 great roots reach into 3 different realms. One into Asgard itself, where the gods dwell. One into Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, where it draws from Mimir's well of wisdom. And one deep into Niflheim, the world of cold and primordial mist. Its branches shelter Midgard, the world of humans, and spread further still, carrying the sky, the eagle that perches at its crown, the hawk Vedrfolnir that rests between the eagle's eyes, the squirrel Ratatoska, who runs endlessly up and down, carrying insults between the eagle above and the dragon Nidhogg gnawing at the roots below. Yggdrasil is not a metaphor. In the Norse worldview, it was the literal structure of existence. The tree was the world. And at the root that reaches into Asgard, at the very foundation of the divine realm, sits the well. The name Urdabrunner means roughly well of Urd, taking its name from the eldest Norn. Some scholars translate it simply as the well of fate. The water that fills it is described by Snorri Sturluson in Gylfaginning so sacred that anything placed in it emerges white as the membrane inside an eggshell, pure, transformed, made new. White clay surrounds the well. 2 swans swim there, and from those 2 birds, says Snorri, came all the swans in the world. Every day the Norns draw water from this well and mix it with that white clay, and they pour it over the roots and trunk of Yggdrasil to keep it living. This is not a minor task. Yggdrasil suffers constantly, gnawed at by the dragon and countless serpents below, browsed by deer among its upper branches, eternally tested by the forces of chaos that press against all structures. Without the Norns' daily care, the tree would die, and if the tree died, the 9 worlds would collapse. So the beings who determine the fate of every living thing are also, every single day, the ones keeping reality intact. That is not a coincidence. It is the Norse worldview expressed in a single image. Fate and existence are the same thing. The Norns shape your destiny with the same hands that hold the world together. Let's talk about the names, because this is where the story becomes more interesting than most people know and more contested than almost anyone mentions. The popular account goes like this. Urd represents the past, Verdandi represents the present, and Skuld represents the future. 3 women, 3 tenses, 3 aspects of time. Clean, satisfying. The kind of symmetry that makes mythology easy to teach in a classroom. Here is what the scholarship actually says. Both Urd and Verdandi derive from the Old Norse verb verda, to become, or more dynamically, to come into being. The root traces back through Proto-Germanic all the way to a Proto-Indo-European root, meaning to turn. Urd is the past tense form. That which has become, or that which has already happened. Verdandi is the present participle. That which is becoming. So far the past and present reading holds. But Skuld is different. Skuld comes from the verb skulu, related to the English shall and should, but carrying, as scholar Karen Beck-Pedersen points out in her landmark 2011 study, The Norns in Old Norse Mythology, a meaning closer to debt. Skuld is not simply the future. Skuld is that which is owed, that which must happen because of what has come before. Not a neutral description of time to come, but a consequence, a reckoning built into the structure of existence. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Beck Pedersen, whose work remains the most thorough academic study of the Norns in any language, argues that we should be cautious about the whole past, present, future framework entirely. She notes that the three Norns only appear together by name in two sources, the Völuspa stanzas and Snorri's Gylfaginning, where the second account appears to be drawing directly from the first. More provocatively, she argues that Verdandi may be a relatively late addition, perhaps created specifically to complete a chronological sequence that earlier traditions did not actually possess. The name Verdandi, she suggests, may have been coined by a medieval writer who had already absorbed the idea that fate figures should come in three temporal aspects, and who needed a middle term to complete the pattern. If this is right, and Beck Pedersen is careful to frame this as a scholarly argument, not a proven fact, then the triumvirate of past, present, and future is at least partly a construction, a later organizing frame imposed on beings who were, originally, something stranger and less symmetrical. What the Norns actually embody, according to the more careful reading, may be closer to this. Urd is the weight of what has already happened, the accumulated past that cannot be changed and that shapes everything following it. Skuld is the debt that past creates, the obligations, consequences, and reckoning that future moments must pay. And Verdandi is the turning point between them, the live moment where past becomes future, where what has been becomes what will be owed. Not 3 points on a timeline, 3 aspects of consequence. Remember this interpretation, because we'll return to it in the final section, and then it will mean something different than it does now. When people think of the Norns at work, they almost always picture the same image. 3 women weaving at a loom, threading the lives of gods and mortals through their fingers, measuring and cutting. It is an image so powerful and so persistent that it has become definitional. The Norns are the weavers of fate. But here is what most retellings leave out. The original Norse sources do not actually describe the Norns weaving. This is a genuine scholarly point, and it matters. The Völuspa says the Norns carved on wood, scored the wood, in some translations, inscribing their decrees on wooden slips. This almost certainly refers to runes, the carved symbols that were, in Norse culture, far more than a mere alphabet. Runes were understood as symbols of cosmic forces, each one connected to a specific power in the universe. When Snorri describes the Norns' activities in Gylfaginning, he says they sprinkle Yggdrasil with water and clay. He does not describe them weaving. The closest explicit description of fate weaving involving the Norns comes from a single poem, Helgakvida Hundingsbana I, one of the heroic poems in the Poetic Edda, describing the birth of the hero Helgi. At that birth, Norns arrive in the night and work with what the poem calls Örlog Thattu, fate threads. They fasten these threads to the sky, stretching them across the lands that Helgi will rule, anchoring them north and east and west. Beck Pedersen has analyzed this passage carefully and notes that the action described sounds less like weaving on a loom and more like braiding, a different textile metaphor entirely, one that implies active construction rather than simple measurement. Think about the difference. A weaver works from a fixed frame, filling in a pattern someone else has established. A braider takes separate strands and creates the structure itself. The distinction is small and enormous at the same time. The other famous fate-weaving scene in Old Norse literature, the grisly passage in Njal's saga where women work at a loom using severed heads as weights and intestines as thread, explicitly describes Valkyries, not Norns. The two categories of fate-shaping women have been conflated over centuries of retelling. so the truth is more various than the standard image. The Norns used at least 3 methods to shape fate: carving runes onto wood, working with fate threads at significant births, and according to other sources, casting wooden lots for divination. The image of spinning thread comes partly from later influence, from medieval contact with stories of the Greek Moirai, who were explicitly spinners, and partly from the general Norse understanding that women's textile work was a symbol of creation and domestic power. The weaving image is not wrong, but it arrived from somewhere, and knowing where it arrived from tells you something important about how stories change when cultures meet. Here is a detail most casual encounters with Norse mythology never mention. Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld are not the only Norns. They are the 3 great ones, the cosmic Norns, who tend Yggdrasil and hold the broadest threads of universal fate. But beside them, the Norse world was full of lesser Norns, beings who came to individual people at the moment of birth to speak that person's specific destiny. The Prose Edda describes this clearly. Snorri writes that there are Norns of the race of gods, others of the elf people, and still others of the kindred of the dwarves. The poem Fafnismar puts it even more starkly in the voice of the dying dragon Fafnir, who tells the hero Sigurd, "Of many births must the Norns be, yet not of one race." The diversity of the Norns mirrors the diversity of the 9 worlds themselves. Not all of these lesser Norns were benevolent. Snorri is unusually blunt on this point. He writes plainly, "Good Norns of fine kin shape good lives, but those who end up ill-fated, that is ruled by wicked Norns." This is a striking statement in a mythological tradition that often frames fate as impersonal and beyond moral judgment. Here, the quality of a Norn attending your birth could determine whether your life was fortunate or cursed, something uncomfortably personal woven into what might otherwise seem like a neutral cosmic mechanism. Evidence of this personal Norn belief survived well into the Christian period. A runic inscription carved into the entrance of the Borgund Stave Church in Norway, from a building dated to roughly the 12th century, a century and a half after Christianity officially came to Scandinavia, reads, "Thor carved these runes on the eve of Olaus Mass when he traveled past here. The Norns did both good and evil. Great toil they made for me." Think about what that means. A medieval Norwegian Christian stopping at a Christian stave church on a holy day, Kormstista, pauses to carve a message about the Norns. Not a prayer, not an invocation, a complaint, raw and personal. The Norns have been giving him trouble. The old belief did not disappear when the old faith was officially replaced. It went underground, into the cracks, into the graffiti left on holy walls by travelers who found, when their lives went wrong, that the language they had for it was still the older one. Here is the question that has occupied scholars of Norse mythology for generations, and that you may be lying there turning over yourself right now. If the Norns have already written everything, what is the point of doing anything? This is the problem of Norse fatalism, and it has a more sophisticated answer than the paralysis it initially suggests. The Norse word most often translated as fate is örlog, sometimes rendered as primal layers or fundamental laws. It refers not to a specific future event decreed in advance, but to the deep structural conditions of a life, who you were born to, what era you inhabit, what the accumulated actions of your ancestors have laid down. Örlog is the shape of the container. It is not every drop of water that flows through it. Related to this is the concept of wired, the Old English cognate that gives us our word weird in its original sense of fated, uncanny, connected to destiny's strange logic. In the Old English poem Beowulf, the phrase often rendered as "fate goes as it must," is not a cry of defeat. It is an acknowledgement that the structure of existence is real, and that working within it with courage and honor is the only meaningful response. The Havamal, the collection of gnomic wisdom attributed to Odin in the Poetic Edda, makes the same point in starker terms, in a verse rendered by translator Caroline Larrington as "Cattle die, kinsmen die, and you yourself will die, but the fame of a good name never dies for the one who earns it well." The Norse were not fatalists in the paralyzed sense. They believed the arc of a life was given, that certain deaths came for certain people on certain days, but that the manner of meeting that arc was entirely yours. You could die well or die badly. You could face the Norns' decree with courage or with cowardice. The decree would come either way, but the way you walked toward it was the meaning of everything. Scholar H.R. Ellis Davidson, in her foundational work, Gods and Myths of Northern Europe, describes this as a belief that man could influence his own fate, at least to some extent, by his courage and his choices. The Norse, she argues, saw destiny not as a prison, but as a framework, one that demanded you fill it with the best possible version of yourself. There is something in this that speaks directly to where you are right now, in the dark, at the end of a day you have already lived. The Norns have already carved what they have carved. You cannot open the bark of Yggdrasil and revise your entry, but the manner of continuing, that still belongs to you entirely, the way it has always belonged to everyone who ever lay awake in the dark thinking about it. Even Odin could not read the runes the Norns had carved without a price. This is the story the Havamal tells, from Odin's own voice, which is the voice of the poem itself. Odin had already sacrificed one eye to Mimir's well for a drink of the wisdom held in those deep waters. He had gathered knowledge from ravens, from seeresses, from giants and dwarves and dead women called back from hell. But the runes, the symbols the Norns carved into Yggdrasil to enact their decrees, the deep language in which fate was written, those were not his. They came from the well, from the Norns' domain, not from his. To reach them, Odin performed an act that has no real parallel in any mythology of the world. He hanged himself from a branch of Yggdrasil. He stabbed himself with his own spear. He forbade any of the other gods to give him food or water, and he hung there, above the well of Urd, looking down into the sacred dark of the water where the Norns' work was done, for 9 days and 9 nights. At the end of the 9th night, the runes rose from the well to meet him. What this means, theologically, is significant. The runes were not Odin's invention. They were not a divine gift that descended from above. They were something the Norns already possessed and used, something that existed in the well before the gods themselves came to power. Odin's ordeal was an act of sacrifice and petition, not creation. He was learning to read a script the Norns had been writing long before he existed. This is the detail that reframes everything about Odin's power. His 9 magical songs, the 18 rune spells he recites in the Havamal, the vast knowledge that makes him the All-Father, all of it came from a place that was already there. A place tended by 3 women who answered to no one. The most powerful god in the Norse cosmos was a student. The well was the teacher, and the teachers had been there from the beginning. Now we arrive at what I promised at the beginning, the detail that changes the meaning of everything. The Norns were not gods. They were not created by the gods. They were not subject to the gods in any way. According to the Völuspá, they came from Jotunheim, the realm of the Jotnar, the giants who are the gods' oldest adversaries, the beings who will fight against the Aesir at Ragnarök, whose kin include the Midgard serpent and Fenrir the wolf. And here is what the poem says happened when they arrived. It says the gods' golden age ended, not through war, not through conquest, simply through the Norns' presence. The arrival of 3 giantesses at the base of Yggdrasil was enough to close forever the chapter of careless divine happiness and open the chapter of consequence, of the Norns' carved decrees, of Urlog and death, and the long road toward Ragnarök. This is a genuinely strange mythological statement. The beings who gave meaning to existence, who made it possible for lives to have weight and direction, came from the wild, dangerous outside realm of the giants. Order in the Norse cosmos did not descend from above. It was carried in from the margins, from the very forces the gods feared most, by women who simply started working. What the sources hint at, without quite saying outright, is that the Norns may represent a more ancient layer of Germanic belief, the female fate figures who were the original powers in a world before the warrior gods took center stage. When the Völuspá says the Norns' arrival disturbed the gods' ease, it may be encoding a cultural memory, the memory of a time when a different kind of sacred power was recognized, and when its recognition changed what the divine world meant. Karen Beck Pedersen, John Lindo, and Hilda Ellis Davidson all acknowledge that the Norns occupy a category of their own, one that sits outside the normal divine hierarchy and bends it simply by existing. Their origin in Jotunheim is not incidental. It is the point. The beings who set the laws of the cosmos were never tame, never allied, never owing anything to the gods who lived within those laws. And now the interpretation of Skuld as debt comes full circle. Skuld is not simply the future. Skuld is the obligation that accrues from everything that has been. The Norns themselves embody that principle. They came from the wild, and what arrived with them is the debt every existence owes to consequence. That is the meaning I was pointing toward in the names section, and this is where it lands. You may have noticed by now that the Norns sound familiar from other traditions, and you are not wrong. The Greek Moirai are the most obvious parallel. Clotho the spinner, Lachesis the allotter, Atropos the inevitable cutter of the thread, 3 women controlling every life from birth to death, their authority exceeding even Zeus in most accounts. The Roman Parche played the same role with different names: Nona, Decima, Morta. In Baltic mythology, the goddess Laima and her sisters Carta and Dekla form a fate trinity. Ancient Irish belief preserved 7 fate goddesses who worked with the thread of destiny. The Celtic Matris, triple mother goddesses depicted on stone reliefs across Roman-era Britain and the Rhine Valley, echo the same pattern, holding fruits, infants, and symbols of both life and death in equal hands. The evidence of a shared Proto-Indo-European origin for all of these figures is strong. The linguistic connections run deep. The root of the word Norn may derive from a term meaning to twine, connecting it to the spinning metaphors of the Moirai. The Indo-European root that gives us both Norn and weird traces back to the concept of turning and becoming, the same root that gives Latin its word vertere, to turn. But the differences matter too, and they are where the Norse tradition becomes most itself. The Moirai spin, measure, and cut thread. 3 distinct operations, 3 distinct figures, each with a clearly assigned role. The Norse Norns are less specialized and more ecological. They water the tree. They carve runes into bark. They braid fate threads across the sky at a hero's birth. Their activity is more varied, more embedded in the daily maintenance of reality than the cleaner Greek model of spinning and cutting. The Moirai manage destiny. The Norns sustain the structure within which destiny is possible, and the Norns' independence is more complete. The Greek fates existed within a cosmos ultimately presided over by Zeus. Even if he couldn't always overrule them, he had a relationship with them that acknowledged his authority. The Norse Norns have no such relationship with Odin. They came from a realm he cannot control. Their well predates his power. He learned what he knows from observing their work. This is the detail that travels forward through time, because it means the Norns represent something the gods cannot absorb or explain. They are the limit of divine authority, expressed in the form of 3 women carving runes beside a well. The Norns did not stay confined to Iceland. Richard Wagner, composing his 4-opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen over 26 years in the 19th century, placed the Norns at the very opening of Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, the final opera in the cycle. 3 women weave a rope of fate together, passing it between them, narrating the history of the world, the cutting of the world ash for Wotan's spear, the unraveling of cosmic order, until the rope snaps in their hands. Wagner drew these figures directly from the Eddic sources. In his version, the breaking of the rope signals that the age of gods is ending. The Norns vanish into the earth, and what comes after is no longer their domain. And before Wagner, there was Shakespeare. Though, the connection is more oblique and more fascinating than it might first appear. The 3 weird sisters in Macbeth are not named Norns. They are witches, by Shakespeare's time, embedded in the anxieties of Jacobean England. But the word weird is the direct Old English descendant of Weird, which is the Old English equivalent of Urd, the eldest Norn's name, the very word for fate itself. When Shakespeare's witches call themselves the Weird Sisters, they are, etymologically, calling themselves the Weird Sisters, invoking a concept that stretches back through Old English literature to the same Germanic root that produced the Norse Nornir. Whether Shakespeare himself knew this is uncertain. The 3 prophetic women in Holinshed's chronicles, which he used as a source, may have preserved an older cultural memory through the generations. The Norns appear in contemporary culture too, in the God of War video game series, in modern heathenry movements that have drawn on Eddic, sources to reconstruct Norse religious practice, in Norse-themed fantasy literature and art. The image of 3 women at the root of the world, knowing what no one else can know and saying only what they must, has proven remarkably persistent. Perhaps because it describes something real about human experience. The sense that the deep structure of a life was settled before we arrived in it, and that what we do within that structure is the only freedom we actually possess. Here is the question I want to leave you with before the story settles. Why do the Norns carve instead of speaking? All the other prophetic figures in Norse mythology speak. The vulva speaks. Odin interrogates dead women and giants and makes them answer. Prophecy in the Norse tradition is overwhelmingly oral. A thing said, declaimed, cried from the edge of vision. Even the runes, when used for magic, were spoken as well as carved. But the Norns do not speak their decrees. They carve them. Into wood, into the bark of Yggdrasil, into the structure of the world itself. Scholar Karen Beck Pedersen draws attention to this and connects it to the legal language surrounding the Norns in the sources. The phrase Norna Dömer, judgment of the Norns, appears repeatedly in skaldic poetry, and in almost every instance it means death. Not fate in the abstract, but the final reckoning, the moment when the Norns' carved decree arrives in physical reality. Her analysis connects this to the Norse concept of fate as a kind of law, not metaphorically, but structurally. The Norns' runic symbols were binding in the way that a legal judgment is binding, not because of divine will, not because of divine mercy, but because of an authority that simply is, that precedes and supersedes every other authority in the cosmos. This is the Norse understanding, expressed without softening. Existence is not a story being told by the gods. It is a document being maintained by three women at the root of the world. The gods participate in it the way everyone else does. They are characters in a text whose authors preceded them and will outlast them. What saves this from being merely bleak is what the Norse added to it. The Havamal does not respond to this reality with despair. It responds with the injunction to live well within it, to act honorably, to give generously, to do what you would want to be remembered for, knowing that memory is the only immortality anyone, god or mortal, can actually achieve. Ragnarök will come. Yggdrasil will shake. The Norns thread will run out for every living thing. But what you made of the time between your first breath and your last, that is carved somewhere too. The story is finished now. Or it has arrived at the place where stories like this one settle rather than end. Into the dark. Into the quiet space where meaning lives when words stop. Three women sit at the root of the world, and they have always been sitting there. That was the thing you started this night with. The gods were powerful, beloved, feared, and they could not change what the Norns had carved. Not Odin's eye, not his ravens, not all 9 days hanging on the world tree. What was written was written. What was owed would come due. There is something in that not of terror, but of relief. The deepest framework of existence is not in anyone's hands. Not the mighty, not the clever, not the ones with the lightning or the ravens or the hammer. It is in the hands of three women beside a well, doing the daily work of keeping a very old tree alive, and inscribing with great care the shape of every life. You are in that shape. The broad lines were laid down before you knew what your name meant, but the manner of inhabiting them, the particular way you have moved through what was given, that is yours, entirely. The way it has always been yours. That's not nothing. Rest now. You don't have to hold on to any part of tonight. The Norns will. Keep the tree standing until morning. Whatever they have written for you, they have already written it, and it will be there when you wake. If this story found you at the right hour, if the well felt real tonight, if the sound of carving in the dark felt like something you recognized, consider finding sleepable mythology again. There are more of these waiting. More wells, more gods who wanted more than they had. More beings at the edge of the known world who turned out to hold the whole thing together. The well is deep, and the tree is old. Good night.